Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Martin Hess as our speaker. Dr. Hess has recently published a book, The Politics of Police Diplomacy, The Australian Experience. It is a groundbreaking book on the importance of police work in UN peacekeeping operations. His presentation this evening is entitled Australian Police Diplomacy, What It Is and Why It Matters. I have no doubt that his presentation will be fascinating, particularly given his personal experience in UN operation in Cyprus and East Timor and an AFP operation in Afghanistan. So with no further ado, please welcome Dr. Hess.
Okay. I think I'm going to get my old watch started then. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all police present, past, serving and emerging. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement to members of other emergency services present, especially those involved in the health sector. Their service is our safety and well-being, and if someone like me doesn't thank them, no one else will. Secondly, I'd like to thank both Heath McMichael from the AIIA ACT branch and Professor Bill Maley for being here and for their support. Bill in particular has been a highly supportive member, supportive of the diplomatic efforts of the AFP and of me personally, as he supervised my doctoral thesis upon which this presentation and my book is based. So thank you, Bill, wherever you are. You here? Thanks, Bill. Truly a national treasure. So what is police diplomacy? I did have a slideshow, but not possible apparently. At a micro or individual level, it's evident that police share many of the individual qualities of diplomats. Canadian academic Darryl Copeland, in his 2009 book, Guerrilla Diplomacy, lists the qualities of new diplomats to include autonomy, agility, acuity, and resilience, the ability to generate and use intelligence, personal and situational sensitivity, local knowledge, cultural awareness, and linguistic and communication skills, irregular representational capabilities and characteristics, an affinity for collaboration and teamwork, functionality in conflict situations, connectedness to the global political economy of knowledge, the capacity enhanced by science and technology to act with suppleness and a catalytic and transformational orientation. Some good words there. Further, it's also been said that the qualities of diplomat include a quick mind, a hard head, a strong stomach, a warm smile, and a cold eye. Any police in the room will know exactly what that means, attending things like car accidents, fatals, assaults, etc., etc. It's asserted that police, official diplomats or not, display all of the above characteristics as a normal part of their daily duties, dealing with crises, crime, criminals, witnesses, and victims with humanity, compassion, impartiality, and objectivity. This is the very essence of the Pelian policing model upon which Australian policing is built. So I need to distinguish also between Track 1 and Track 2 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy is official government-to-government, official diplomatic government-to-government dealings. Track 2, non-government organisations. I remember talking to Bill about it. Where are the police in this? They're just not represented in that literature. I know that police, at the time I was starting my PhD, police were deployed regionally and further afield. So I suggested with Bill a PhD topic. We then went through the processes and hey presto, here I am 20 years later, nearly 20 years later. Need to also outline the national interest and international good citizenship. In my mind, I sought to address two questions in relation to diplomacy. I asked not what diplomacy is, but why it is done, and concluded there are two primary motives for diplomacy. Firstly, to serve the national interest, and secondly, to contribute to global good citizenship. In relation to defence, I asked, what are we defending and what are we defending it from? We can talk about physical security, we can talk about national sovereignty, national interest, all that sort of stuff. From a policing and justice perspective, we're also defending our liberal democratic values and principles. And I've concluded that they are under potential threat by non-democratic forces in our region, aided and abetted by some in our own domestic body politic. Effective policing, both domestically and internationally, serves both the national interest and global good citizenship, depending on what they are doing, as well as when and where they are doing it. The terms soft and hard diplomacy come up. Distinction needs to be drawn between traditional soft diplomacy and hard military intervention. They're the two extremes of government intervention internationally. Policing and justice is a form of firm diplomacy, as it deals in part with things like investigation, arrest, prosecution, and incarceration of offenders. This is the essence of the justice-based solutions that we espouse under the rule of law. There is also a security justice continuum. Policing in a functioning liberal democracy like ours are less about rigid and forceful enforcement of security and more about the passive administration of justice. And the example I would provide would be proceeding by summons rather than making an arrest where possible. It's a fairly benign model that we've inherited from our British past. One commonly asked question is why police rather than military? I'll refer to Brendan Nelson, the former director of the War Memorial, at the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta in Canberra in 2015, where he delivered a very good speech about the rule of law and the direct inheritance deriving from Magna Carta from 1215, and spoke of the military, air and naval forces who served overseas to preserve and defend this. All very good stuff. But when I was lining up for a cup of tea and a scone at the end, I asked him why he didn't mention police, policing, the courts or justice once during his speech. His reply was, they're all the same. This is wrong-headed and explains much of the reasoning that Australian policing efforts remain unknown to the general public. This is reinforced by studies in things like security sector reform, where police are invariably placed in the security sector column, where in fact security is in fact a very small part of liberal democratic policing. We do it, but only in extreme circumstances, public order sort of circumstances, siege type situations, etc., where force is required. But the actual principle is once force has been used, maximum force has been used to the extent of policing, it then reverts to a normal passive situation. It's not a constant. I then looked at cooperation and competition. Military forces, no matter where they are, do much the same thing. They engage in combat, so the bigger, faster, better equipped and better led they are, the more competitive they are and the better they are to achieve their objective of defeating their military adversaries. Traditional diplomacy also has its share of competitiveness, even with friends and allies, as the recent trade situation involving the US exemplifies. Police, on the other hand, do not ever set out to defeat or outmaneuver another police force. In fact, police are far more effective in their roles of protecting their respective communities from criminal activity, the more they cooperate and complement each other. Australia has a long and proud history of such engagements. On peace, there's a hierarchy of priorities. Peace, security, safety and prosperity. All are subordinate to peace. Paraphrasing several wise thinkers over the ages, peace is not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice, which is the firmest pillar of good government. If there is either the presence of conflict or the absence of justice, the notion of peace, security, safety and prosperity are compromised. So in my book, I outlined 5 different stages. They are my stages. I would normally have a slideshow, but they were different phases. They're not formal. They weren't intended by the police when they did it. They were just for ease of analysis, really, and breakdown of what I was trying to say. Part 1 was the Cold War and the Great Peace, 1964 to 1998. Part 2, Democracy, Violence and the New Security Paradigm, 1999 to 2007. Part 3, Capacity Building and the New Security Paradigm, 2003 to 2014. You'll note that some of these are overlapping. Part 4, Applying the Rule of Law in Challenging Environments, 2007 to 14. And Part 5, Australian Security and Sovereignty in the Asian Century, 2014 to 24. In fact, to the present. Part 1, the Cold War and the Great Peace, 64 to 98. At the request of the British government for Australian military forces in Cyprus, Patrick Shaw, who was the first assistant secretary, sent a minute to the Minister for External Affairs outlining several reasons Australia should deploy police to Cyprus. Among the most relevant in the context of East Timor 35 years later in 1999 is the principle that the UN Security Secretary General was guided by the principle that in any such operation, countries with a specific interest should, if possible, be excluded. Australia has much to gain by establishing this principle and by establishing this as a general duty of the United Nations to help solve distant disputes to which they are not strategically concerned. Mention was also made that Cyprus is a Commonwealth country, and I note the presence of Matthew Newhouse and Angela here tonight from the Royal Commonwealth Society, ACT. This principle applied to all pre-1999 police deployments to places like Cyprus, Cambodia, Mozambique, Haiti and Bougainville, but was turned on its head in 1999 when a large deployment of AFP members was deployed to the troubled Indonesian province of East Timor. And I acknowledge the presence of a number of my East Timor veteran UNIMET colleagues here, sitting in the front here, Dave Savage and Don Barnby. As I said, during that time, the Australian military was preoccupied with fighting communism in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaya, Vietnam, and plus confrontation with Indonesia. Part 2, Democracy, Violence and the New Security Paradigm, 1999 to 2007. Things changed in 1998-99 with East Timor. The politics behind this are quite complex and in some cases contested, but basically the UN was pushing for an electoral solution to a long-running problem with East Timor, and Australia was expected to lead it. Indonesia was brought to the table unwillingly and devised a highly flawed security agreement with Portugal and the United Nations. The Indonesian military refused to have an international military peacekeeping force on what they regarded as Indonesian sovereign territory. This was estimated to require between 12,000 and 16,000, I'll say that again, 12,000 to 16,000 fully armed and supported military peacekeepers. Instead, the Australian government sent 50 members of the AFP as part of a UN civilian police component of around 270, unarmed. UNCIVPOL was unarmed. Despite harassment, intimidation and violence by Indonesian military proxy militia forces, 95% of the population registered to vote and actually cast a vote. The result was 78.5% in favour of separating from Indonesia. After the ballot, security broke down completely and a long-planned military scorched earth campaign went overt. As UNIMET withdrew to be replaced by Interfet, an estimated 1,200 to 1,600 East Timorese were murdered and an estimated 25,000 people displaced to Indonesian West Timor, as 70% of the infrastructure was destroyed in a deliberate scorched earth policy conducted by the Indonesian military, police and militia forces. The AFP was witness to many of these atrocities, and my friend and colleague Dave Savage went back as a war crimes investigator to investigate these things. There is little doubt that the brave actions of UNIMET, by delaying what was going on and being just an international presence, that UNCIVPOL, including AFP, prevented escalation and potential civil war, because the intent, we believe, was for the Indonesians to provoke the Falentil to come out of their cantonments, start a civil war, and they could then legitimately fly in reinforcements from mainland Indonesia, and they would have won completely. They just would have wiped them out. There is little doubt that the brave actions of UNIMET and CIVPOL prevented escalation and potential civil war, as I said. This bought enough time for the international community, led by US President Clinton, to pressure Indonesia to accept Interfet. In the post-9/11 environment, these interventions provided a catalyst for Osama bin Laden to give the green light to Islamic extremists in Indonesia to detonate bombs in Bali, killing over 200, including 88 Australians. To justify bringing his version of global jihadism to the Southeast Asian region, bin Laden stated that East Timor had been excised from the Islamic nation of Indonesia by the combined crusader forces of the United Nations and Australia. It was thus interpreted as an attack on Islam, making Australians legitimate targets. He was factually incorrect because, as a legacy of its Portuguese colonial antecedents, East Timor was and remains an overwhelmingly Catholic country. 3 explosions were detonated on the 12th of October 2002 by these extremists known as Jemaah Islamiyah. They killed 202 people, including 88 Australians. The response from Australia was immediate and included the deployment of significant numbers of AFP members. The first people the Indonesian police contacted were the AFP. And within 24 hours, a team of disaster victim identification, post-blast analysts, search and rescue experts, intelligence people and investigators was on the ground assisting alongside international police counterparts from countries whose citizens had also been killed. In a domestic sense, the efficacy of a national policing body with representation in all mainland capitals and all international airports was a major factor in securing information and evidence, as by 02:30 on the 13th of October, so within hours, the first commercial flights chartered by the Australian government evacuating survivors began arriving at Australian airports, where passengers were interviewed, statements were taken and physical evidence was collected by members of the AFP awaiting their arrival. This resulted in statements being taken from passengers from 19 flights over a 2-week period and the collection and collation of information from 7,340 passenger questionnaires, which led to 450 relevant leads. The investigation resulted in the prosecution and eventual execution of 3 offenders. The relationship between the AFP and the Indonesian National Police continues to be professional and respectful and is an extremely important part of the relationship between these two countries. East Timor declared independence as Timor-Leste in 2002, and the AFP continues to serve in Timor-Leste as part of a capacity development mission. Part 3, Capacity Building and the New Security Paradigm, 2003 to 2014. With the growing confidence by the Howard government in the AFP as an effective instrument of foreign policy, the next major development was the Solomon Islands with the Ramsay mission. Despite concerns raised about neo-colonialism in some areas of DFAT and a lack of interest by defence planners, and despite smart-ass media comments about being a deputy sheriff, Prime Minister Howard persisted and engaged 14 participating police forces through the Pacific Islands Forum. The R in Ramsay stands for regional. The importance of the Pacific face of Ramsay needs to be highlighted. Ramsay is now a blueprint for such interventions. Howard actually went against Downer and I think it was, I can't remember who the Defence Minister was, but Moore, I think, went against both of those, advice from both of those departments and ploughed on ahead and created Ramsay. Good on him. The PPF set about disarming the militants, and more than 3,730 weapons and more than 30,000 rounds of ammunition were removed from the militia. About 700 of those were high-powered military-style weapons. These were destroyed publicly before large crowds of onlookers in a potent display of commitment to ridding the nation of firearms. In relation to the different timeframes involved in such interventions, AFP Commander McDevitt explained that in a meeting, the military representative said securing the strategic military points would take 32 days, and then the military would be ready to withdraw. McDevitt then explained that the community had lost trust in the Solomon Islands Police, and the police component of the mission could take up to 10 years. He says a representative from another agency, presumably AusAid, then talked at length about endemic corruption in the country. Further, there was a need for significant programs in infrastructure, finance and all other departments. The assessment was it would take a generation to make the necessary changes. Just gives you an idea of the different timescales that people think of depending on what their roles and tasks are and their agencies are. In 27th of September 1999, after the deployment of Interfet, in relation to the deputy sheriff title that he never actually said, Howard was actually a journalist who put it to him and he didn't deny it. The Howard government, John Howard said, "We do not seek to ever impose our views on other countries. We do not seek any kind of regional police role. We seek rather to act in concert with friendly nations within our region to achieve mutually shared outcomes." It should also be remembered there are only 5 countries in the Southwest Pacific which have military forces: Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Papua New Guinea and Tonga. All Southwest Pacific nations have police forces, so police-to-police engagement is a natural fit. Ramsay set the scene for similar capacity development police missions, including in countries like Vanuatu, Samoa, Tonga and Papua New Guinea. How these nations administer their policing and justice systems has implications not just for the citizens of those nations, but also in a more strategic sense for Australia and Australia's sea lines of communication. Along with Southeast Asia, the Southwest Pacific has become a zone of contested ideas and political systems, with Chinese-based authoritarian policing models competing with Western-based liberal democratic models. This has implications, as I've mentioned. Part 4, applying the rule of law in challenging circumstances, 2007 to 2014. Is that my glass of water? Excuse me. In 2006, in Afghanistan, 2006, again, at the request of the British government, they requested police assistance for their engagement in Afghanistan. This request is made to assist with the narcotics trade. The UK had been allocated narcotics as its primary line of effort, as long as one of the provinces. The US was allocated development of the military, the German police development, and the Italians the criminal justice system. I recall one British diplomat telling me that he thought these allocations were worked out on the back of a fag packet. Due to delays in securing visas, etc., by the time the first 4 AFP members deployed in late 2007, things had moved on. When the Rudd government was elected, things had changed again. Prime Minister Rudd, in opposition, had cornered himself politically by overt statements that Iraq was bad but Afghanistan was good, primarily because the UN had an office and a small mission there. In government, he was faced with the reality that Australia had lost many military members. We ended up losing 41 there. He thus sought an alternative. When the Obama administration took office in the US, the decision was made to move from an emphasis on counter-terrorism to counterinsurgency. It should be noted that in US terms, counter-terrorism means naval gunfire, drones and highly kinetic targeting, including B-52s. Counterinsurgency is population-centric, and in the mind of Prime Minister Rudd, this was clearly a job for the police. It needed to be borne in mind Prime Minister Howard's words with the International Deployment Group in 2004. Quote, "The purpose of this group will be for the deployment in the region. Nobody should construe from the formation of this group that we have in mind deployment further afield." Regardless and despite this, the IDG specifically intended for support for regional missions, primarily in Ramsey and East Timor, or Timor-Leste, Prime Minister Rudd decided to increase the AFP members deployed to Operation Illuminate in Afghanistan. There was a strong suspicion on our part that the intent was to gradually replace the ADF with the AFP under the guise of the population-centric nature of counterinsurgency. The problem was that southern Afghanistan was an active war zone, and any attempt at installing a workable justice system, including police, was highly problematic. There were some clear frustrations among some ADF members. I recall one senior ADF officer asking me, "When does the blue take over?" My answer to him was, "When you win the war, we'll keep the peace." Aside from the obvious security challenges, the problems with local police included high levels of opium addiction and high levels of illiteracy, as well as unknown affiliations with the Taliban. No amount of mentoring in the field outside the wire was going to make the slightest impact on these entrenched problems. AFP involvement in Afghanistan was high risk with almost zero return and rang the death knell for the IDG. Ukraine. In July 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was brought down by a Russian missile in eastern Ukraine, killing all on board, including just under 40 Australians. An immediate response and longer-term investigation led by the Dutch police under the auspices of the OSCE was conducted. This resulted in the prosecution in absentia of 4 identified Russian and Ukrainian suspects, 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian. 3 were convicted. The AFP played an instrumental role in the response, investigation and the prosecution. It doesn't get much bigger than taking a former superpower to court. It must be stressed that Operation Aru, which was that operation, was not an IDG operation, but a broader AFP operation. Russian obstructionism, however, leads one to question organisations like the UN. Russia is a member of the Permanent 5 of the UN Security Council, along with China, the US, Britain and France. There are some who consider the UN to be the answer to many of the world's problems. Allow me to address this. In my own small way, I played a small part in relation to the investigation of the murder of a Greek Cypriot by a Turkish soldier in Cyprus in 1996. We compiled a brief of evidence and sent it to UN headquarters in New York, where it disappeared. No action was taken. I later asked an academic in Canberra about this, and his response was along the lines that if we charge people in such countries, the UN would not be allowed in as peacekeepers. Along with my colleagues in East Timor in '99 and follow-up missions, I've seen indictments of tens of Indonesian military and police for crimes such as kidnapping, torture, rape, and the murder of between 1,200 and 1,600 East Timorese. These indictments were compiled by the UN itself, but they've been gradually swept under the carpet. 3 of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council have been actively involved in or overtly supportive of crimes involving mass casualty, including allegations of genocide. This is not peace as defined by the absence of conflict and the presence of justice. It is something else, and in my view, it's fraudulent and unethical. The UN is dominated by these unethical influences and yet is quite fond of giving directions to first world human rights observant countries like Australia. Australia has a long and proud history of promoting, upholding and defending human rights in several places around the globe over the past 60 years. When it comes to policing and justice, I don't think Australia, especially Australian policing, should be taking any tuition from discredited organisations like the United Nations. Part 5, Australian Security and Sovereignty in the Asian Century, 2014 to 24. And so we come full circle. The reason police were originally sent to Cyprus in '64 was because the Australian military was preoccupied with fighting the southward expansion of communists in Southeast Asia. Moving forward 60 years, we now have a reclothed form of communism, making inroads by coercing, co-opting and corrupting the elites of the polity in many of our neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. I would highlight 3 recent books written by eminent Australians in relation to Australian security in the face of a rising and expansionist China. The first is Danger on Our Doorstep, written by the late Senator General Jim Molan. This book highlights the potential for the PRC to isolate us via control of our sea lanes of communication. The second is The Next Major War by Ross Babbage, and I saw a presentation by Ross here in this place probably about 18 months ago. 2 years, thank you. Very good presentation. I bought his book, very good book. The Next Major War by Ross Babbage, in which he highlights the preparations the PRC is making for both expansion and conflict, including the use of disintegration operations in the West, with a quoted 1 million operatives pursuing this. Just think of that, 1 million people designed to disintegrate how we live. It's staggering. The third is No Higher Priority by Peter Jennings, Michael Shoebridge and Marcus Hellier. The book outlines a severe lack of preparedness in Australian defence and security efforts and paints an alarming picture of just how vulnerable we are as a liberal democracy in a region where liberal democracy is not the norm. I would point out also that Australian cities are now within striking range of Chinese missiles from mainland China. So coercion is quite simple for those people if they wish to exert leverage on a country like Australia. Australian police diplomacy, what it is and why it matters. If, as some suggest, we're in the foothills of another major conflict, it's worth remembering that one of the objectives of the UN remains to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war by promoting peace operations. If peace is not just the absence of conflict but the presence of justice, then international policing plays a vital role in the pursuit of the international justice-based outcomes which underpin peace. Whilst traditional notions of policing and diplomacy may not automatically sit as natural partners, international relationships, engagement and discourse are changing. We now talk of ping-pong diplomacy, gunboat diplomacy, public diplomacy, cowboy diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, big stick diplomacy, defence diplomacy, military, missionary diplomacy, science diplomacy, sports diplomacy, and others. The obvious question to me is, why not police diplomacy? Serving both international good citizenship and the national interest, the Australian Federal Police has engaged internationally in various capacities over a 60-year period in UN, multilateral and bilateral efforts aimed at peace and justice-based solutions. I submit that as an effective instrument of preventative and restorative diplomacy, the AFP has earned a place as a legitimate participant in foreign policy considerations, and that these efforts serve as an example of how international policing can be done and why it merits its own diplomatic track. There is also a domestic connection. It should be noted that Australia is one of a dwindling minority of liberal democracies globally, with authoritarianism not just on the rise but on the march. The values we treasure, which preserve the Australian status quo as a liberal democracy, need to be acknowledged, preserved, and if necessary, defended aggressively. I'll summarise by saying that for us to avoid the next major war, we need to recognise the danger on our doorstep and that there is no higher priority for Australia and Australians to pay attention to this. It's the business for police to ask difficult questions. I have tried to address the who, what, when, where, how and why Australian police have acted internationally over the past 60 years and established a historical foundation upon which future international police diplomacy pursuing justice-based solutions to some challenges can be built. I recently attended an event commemorating the 9/11 attacks in the United States and the murder by Al-Qaeda of Ahmed Shah Massoud, a brave Afghan, freedom-loving Afghan, hosted by the embassy of the now exiled government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. One of the keynote speakers at this event noted that Afghanistan now is the home to some 23,000 foreign terrorist fighters. I also learned recently there is a number of jihadi training camps in Irian Jaya in the western half of the island of New Guinea, apparently working with the tacit approval and support of sections of the Indonesian military. That's very close to one of our most important sea lanes, which is the Torres Strait. Given the burgeoning relationship between Jakarta and Beijing, as well as Moscow, it's quite clear to me that we are facing a very much heightened risk environment regionally and domestically. As I said, authoritarianism is not just on the rise, but on the march. And our values and principles, as exemplified by our liberal democratic policing, have never been more important, nor have they ever been under such a challenge. One of the risks of increasing authoritarian influence in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific is capture of political elites and regime protection approaches to policing and justice. One longer-term strategic implication is the risk this poses to our sea lines of communication, our trade routes. For a nation dependent upon exports and imports of essentials like fuel and increasingly foodstuffs, this is an unacceptably high risk vulnerability. We need to learn the lessons from history and not just be alert but alarmed at these developments, because history has a terrible habit of repeating itself. Can these outcomes be prevented? Yes, but in addition to our military and foreign services, our Team Australia approach needs to be encouraged and needs to include police at the state, national and international levels. Our posture needs to be clear-sighted and robust. At present, the AFP has members in Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa and Tonga, and is an active member in the Pacific Islands Chiefs of Police, the Pacific Transnational Crime Network, both of which are endorsed by the Pacific Islands Forum. Among other things, the AFP is also an Australian hub for Interpol, which is a global policing organisation, intelligence sharing organisation, and that is based here in Canberra, the Australian bit. There's also an active AFP liaison officer network, which works globally with police partners worldwide, including Europe, the Americas, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Southwest Pacific. I'll finish by saying Australia has a long and distinguished history of effective police diplomacy and can play a significant role in Australia's whole of government future as an extremely effective link between international engagement and domestic outcomes. The preservation of our liberal democratic values and principles in large part depends on it. To paraphrase John Lennon, all I'm saying is give police a chance. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay.
And I'll do the same. Well, thank you very much for very questions. Very specialised area of policing requires expertise. Can you please describe a little bit the extent of the capability that you're talking about? It cannot be all expertise. What is our capability? Have a comment on whether it's enough, and how do you develop the engagement? Okay. All police who deployed were AFP. They were supplemented due to a manpower shortage at some stage with state police, primarily from Victoria and Queensland, with a few others. But I don't think they are doing that anymore. The International Deployment Group in Canberra ceased to exist with the amalgamation of the International Deployment Group with our international branch in 2015. That has now, the IDG concept has now gone to Pinkenbar in Brisbane, and they are training in conjunction with a lot of the regional police forces for UN missions in places like Africa. I don't think there are any state police involved in it anymore. If the state police who were seconded to the AFP were seconded not as state police, they were seconded, sorry, they wore the uniforms of the AFP and they had to go through a certain training program to do that. Does that answer your question? No, I can't. At the moment, I'm not right across numbers at the moment. I just don't know. I think in PNG, it's our largest mission. I think we've got about 40 there at the moment. So it's not, numbers aren't really the issue. It's not like a military where you overwhelm people with numbers. Policing, I'll give you an example. When they had those terrible refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border with something like 10 or 15,000 displaced people from Cambodia on the Thai side of the border, there were 2 Australian superintendents who ran those camps and they allowed the Cambodians to run their own justice system. So it's not about numbers necessarily. It can be, but mostly it's not about numbers. It's about effect. Yeah.
Yes, correct. Only for the online people.
No. The people who deploy as part of the liaison officer network, my understanding is they deploy as under diplomatic passports and they have whatever diplomatic immunities are applicable to official diplomats. But people who deploy with things like UN missions or to places like Afghanistan don't have immunity. Yep.
Sorry. What extent does China directly advise various police forces throughout the Asia-Pacific region?
The specific extent I don't know, but I know they are making inroads certainly in places like the Solomon Islands, and that's aided and abetted by the political system there, or the political elites there, who, when they changed from recognition of, one of the reasons we got involved there as a multilateral organisation, multilateral deployment in 2003 is because the Solomon Islands at that time recognised Taiwan. And any attempt at a UN mission there would have been scuttled by the Chinese in the Security Council. So when they changed their recognition from Taiwan to the PRC, that's when things changed and gradually things have been eroded ever since. So I don't know the extent of it, but I know there are advisors in there. They were quick to rearm some elements of the Solomon Islands police, much against the will of the Solomon Islands population, who still didn't have much trust in their police.
Do you believe that, given the importance of the police force inside UN operations, the importance, as you said, their work, do you think there should be more, the element of the police force in UN operations should be bigger so that at the end the UN operation is actually more efficient? I'm thinking for operations that have been going on for years, like 20 years in the Congo, a place I know quite well. Yeah. Would it be better if the police force element would be bigger?
Yes. The tendency is for most countries to send military people as their representatives to places like the United Nations because they are probably better trained, they're better equipped, etc., etc. Not all police forces are the same around the world. And as a result, decision making in peak bodies like the UN is skewed in favour of military outcomes and military approaches rather than policing outcomes and policing approaches. The AFP did have a liaison officer posted to the UN in New York for a number of years. We had, in fact, one of our UNIMED colleagues was there for a while, but they withdrew that position. I don't know why they did that, but probably because we're no longer really doing many UN missions. There's really no appetite on the conservative side of politics for United Nations involvement. And most UN problem areas are in places where Australia really doesn't have a national interest or a burning national interest. So, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your wonderful presentation. There's a lot of awareness now of soldiers who've come back from war zones and some of the scars that they bear, and that often there's not enough being done in terms of offering them post traumatic care and assisting them through that process, and other veterans. So just wondering if the police, there's actually a need to do more in terms of some of those traumatic experiences you're talking about, some of the war zones they're going into, and whether there's enough preparation, whether there's enough debriefing and enough assistance afterwards, just to make sure that mental health issues are addressed as well.
Bingo, you've hit the belly button. We don't have a DVA. We don't have a RSL. We don't have anything like that. Myself and Dave Savage, Dave was the inaugural president of the AFP Veterans Association, and I succeeded him earlier this year as the president of the AFP Veterans Association. We are completely led by us, volunteers. We get no government support, etc., etc. I've been doing quite a bit of research into the mental health affecting police, not just internationally deployed, but domestically as well, in relation to a fairly new discipline about a thing called moral injury. Our role, for instance, is we've got 5 primary roles in life. That's what police do, is preservation of life, protection of property, bringing offenders to justice, detecting offences, and maintaining the public order. There are 5 primary roles in society. In a place like East Timor, for instance, where things broke down completely, none of that could occur. We're completely outnumbered, outmanoeuvred, outgunned, etc., etc. And we were just basically wiped when we came back from Timor, and that still rankles with us now to this day. So yes, there are significant mental health things. There's a difference, say, for instance, between PTSD and moral injury. PTSD, from my reading of the literature, is more about a threat to your life and well-being. If you're being shot at, bombarded, exposed to landmines, etc., which most military people who are deployed are, they're likely to suffer things like PTSD. Moral injury comes where you have a set moral code, which all Australian police do, which we know what's right and what's wrong. And when we see wrong and can do nothing about it, that affects our moral compass. That's the basis of what I'm researching. So,
Bill had a question.
Marty, you mentioned the diversity of police forces in different parts of the world. Has that been a problem in missions in which the AFP deployed, where you had to work with police from other countries who might have been contributed by their own governments for reasons other than their competence and professionalism? I'm thinking of the story that floated around Cambodia in 1992-93, that there were some people in the police there who had been prisoners who were offered the choice of either serving their sentences or going as police to Cambodia. Not from Australia, of course, but is that a practical problem on a day-to-day basis?
yes, it is. In Timor, for instance, I worked alongside Americans and some British and New Zealand police, and basically we're the same. Our approach to policing and problem solving, and our ability to just say to the Indonesian militia and those sort of people, no, we're unarmed, so you're not going to do it. And these people were used to people running away and at the first sort of threat, and they didn't know what to do. So they basically turned their heels on several occasions in relation to that. There were credible reports by Australians of police from some of our neighbouring Southeast Asian countries who, when things got really hot, were putting on things like Indonesian uniforms, which is not a good testament to their own credibility. and it's not a very good thing about the UN. That's very contentious, and people don't really want to talk about it, but we saw it. So there are also competency issues from countries, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, where the police, you're quite right, some of them were former prisoners, some of them were. One of our colleagues, Phil Hudson, tells a very funny story about a guy who wanted to be a police officer in Timor when he went back with UNTIAT, and his job was a goat herder. And Phil had to keep saying, we've got no vacancies for goat herders here. We don't need goat herders. But this guy was persistent. So to answer your question, yes, there's a huge varying degree of capabilities and training and background and ethical behaviour, in fact, from police forces around the world. It's problematic with the UN. Not so much, well, it probably is with the military as well, but militaries are generally more disciplined and more organised and so and under better supervision. So, and they generally tend to work as groups. So, yeah.
Thanks very much for your presentation, Martin, and in particular raising MH17, where I had the privilege of oversighting the ongoing police activity after that initial impact in Ukraine out of The Hague, where, as you mentioned, they did a tremendous job a fantastic detective job, in fact, both in Kiev and The Hague in the joint case with the Dutch, which then led to very good outcome for us at the International Civil Aviation Organization, which held Russia responsible. Over the weekend, Russia's now taken us to the International Court over that. My point, though, is to ask you about the training for police diplomacy. The police with me all had diplomatic rank. They showed quite diplomatic skill. But and of course, current Commissioner Rhys Kershaw was a former Hague police representative. But what I never could quite get is how much of what you're talking about here, police diplomacy, is actually taught in the AFP. And if it is now well taught there, have we got best practice that we could actually train other police forces in police diplomacy?
Thanks, Matthew. I don't think we train people specifically in police diplomacy. When I retired in mid-2021, I went back to the AFP as a reservist. They're running a reserve system. And one of my roles there for a little while was to facilitate and coordinate some of the training for the combined groups of people going to missions like East Timor, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, etc., combined with the people going to the International Liaison Officer Network. But most of it was transactional type stuff, sort of what you'll do, like not formal diplomacy. I managed to have an hour with these people and explain my views on police diplomacy, but no, it's not formally taught. The skills and values and attributes that police take with them, they're selected, but for these missions, and part of it is aptitude and attitude, part of that selection process. But the skills and attributes I mentioned by Darryl Copeland, the Canadian guy, are skills that police carry with them all the time. It's how we're trained here in Australia, how we approach crime scenes, how we approach witnesses, how we approach offenders, etc., etc. Those skills are reflective in any police force now, walking the streets now, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So no, there's no formal police diplomacy training as such. But if you'd like to write a letter to the new commissioner of the AFP and recommend that, you know what I mean, I'm ready to provide it for a fee.
I worked as ambassador in Cambodia and then as minister in Jakarta, and had a lot to do with the Australian Federal Police over time. And I have to say, one of the most successful police endeavours was after the round of bombing in Indonesia, and you sent quite a large contingent of police to Indonesia, and they worked in the ministry. You know, they lived with the no air conditioning and the poor computing and, you know, the very strange bureaucratic practices. And there was one thing they found quite difficult, and that was our ministers wanted to broadcast their success, and that would have rapidly reduced the Indonesians' willingness to have this happen. So part of the police tradecraft was saying nothing. But I have to say their code of conduct behaviour was very good. In Cambodia, it was less so. You know, things tended to end with golf with criminals and whiskey and then lap dancing. And I was pleased to see an end to that. I couldn't participate. All guys. They were the olden days. But the Indonesian work was very good, and it was noted by everybody, their willingness to muck in with the Indonesians and not take the credit conspicuously.
Thank you. I agree. I think that was a deliberate strategy. It wasn't necessarily to assuage Indonesian sensitivities. It was more that the AFP didn't want to be seen to be taking the lead on these things, to allow the Indonesians to take the credit for whatever investigations were going on. It was to give them space to build their own credibility. Yeah. It always is. The wheels of justice grind pretty slowly, so they just have to put up with that. They've come a long way as Liberal Democratic policing entity from what they were under Suharto to what they are now, and I think not many people give them credit for the way they've developed the way they have. There are still tendencies for pretty serious use of force, etc., like there are in most of those countries, but by and large, they're quite a credible organisation. And I would point out that the AFP Indonesian National Police relationship was one that continued to function even when things after Interfet, Unimed and Interfet and all of the breakdown with Indonesia, the police-to-police relationship was still quite professional. And it was upon that relationship that things built. I actually went back, I was a bit gun shy, but I went back in 2006 when the Lombok Agreement was signed. I was doing part of the close protection oversight for the Indonesian National Police, providing close protection for Bill Farmer, who was the ambassador there. And that was quite salient, I must say, within 7 years to go from we were being targeted in Timor because we were wearing Australian flags to these guys, both Hassan Wiriuda and Alexander Downer, signing the Lombok Agreement and then boarding a Royal Australian Air Force Challenger jet to fly to an APEC meeting in Hanoi, a country we'd been at war with just before. And I know my friend Don Barbie here was a Vietnam veteran. And I remember thinking at the time, what would he think of that? You know, the wheels move further, things move forward and they just keep going and going and going. The Indonesian police or the AFP? Yeah, well, okay. Well, you get no argument from me. I'm a big believer in Team Australia and whole of government operations. We've been doing it. I've been doing it my whole career, including in state-based crime type stuff. It's vital that we do that. None of us are big enough in our own entities to make a difference, but combined we can make a big difference. So,
Well, I just wanted to quickly add to what a couple of other speakers have said, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. 20 years ago, as Ambassador for People Smuggling and Trafficking Issues, I had to work very closely with the AFP. And after the big political push by the Howard government against people smuggling and trafficking, we were all designated to try and make this work on a regional level with collaboration between regional countries and also international organisations. And there are many of the whole of government team in Canberra who really didn't want that to succeed. And I was in charge of running it. And the people that made it work were the AFP. And I said this at the time to my AFP colleagues and for many decades since, and the reason for that was diplomacy. It was sheer diplomacy. Their networks with their regional counterparts were so good that they just went off and ran a whole series of workshops around the region that helped build that connectivity and collaboration to tackle this problem. And that spilled out into a whole range of other areas on a whole of government basis. So just to follow up from Louisa's comments, I wanted to acknowledge that in the context of this discussion.
No, I think we've run out of time. Book for sale?
Yes.
So that's just a practical question, but it's